Welcome back to Rockstock Channel. It is Friday, April 28th, and we are going to focus today on energy storage. Rodney's been banging this drum, for the past, 4 or 5 months, following a meeting with Iola of Rho Motion, I think at a conference late last year, but he was banging the drum also 3-4 years ago. Tesla is now, 100% or more, kind of growth, talking about in terms of gigawatt hours installed energy storage will be bigger than EV in a few years. So most companies or most analysts, I think or Rodney thinks, are understating energy storage in their models. And from a lithium and other raw material perspective, it's something that analysts should focus on. And, so Iola, please tell us about Rho Motion a little bit. We interviewed Adam Panay a few years ago. It's been a while since we've, covered this topic. So tell us a bit about Rho Motion and what you do specifically.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Yeah, I'm with a company called Rho Motion. We're a research house and consultancy based in London. And essentially we provide market analysis and data on the kind of battery market, so on EV, stationary storage, and also the related other markets. So yeah, we have lots of reports and analysis on the markets.
And Ola, just in terms of what you cover specifically?
So I spend a lot of my time looking at the stationary storage markets, as well as getting involved in other pieces of the picture as well.
All right, Rodney's going to start the question. We just want to remind everybody, if you like this video, please, like it and leave a comment on the video. Subscribe to Rockstock Channel, and we are offering early access and extended cuts to videos like this with Iola. If you want those, you please join us on Patreon at patreon.com Rockstock Channel.
Okay, great. If we start off. One of the things, when you look at EV, the estimates around gigawatt hours installed and deployed and so on is very tightly centered around one another with all of the forecasters. But I'm seeing in the ESS is quite a broad spectrum of guessing as to what's deployed, and it, in my opinion, it looks underestimated. Can you just sort of fill us in on 2022 and how you guys saw those numbers?
Yeah, so I mean, the market experienced massive growth last year, pretty much doubled to around 75 gigawatt hours, primarily driven by the Chinese and the US markets. And we're essentially forecasting that it's going to be similar growth again this year. So getting up towards 140, 150 gigawatt hours. And that's new installed capacity.
And is that largely dominated by China and the US?
Exactly. They do make up the majority of the market, and that's really on the back of strong policy support and legislation in those two regions.
And just in terms of the drive, because clearly energy storage is now outstripping EV growth, and it looks like that could continue. What's driving it? The legislation in China and the certain provinces and so on, and the US and targets. What's underpinning that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, essentially storage is kind of an essential part of the energy transition as more renewables added to the grid. Storage is really essential to ensuring that, these renewables can be balanced, and their variable nature means that the grid doesn't collapse, or there's always a supply there of energy. In the Chinese market, you essentially have legislation on a province by province level. So this kind of it comes in different ranges, but essentially the way it works is if you install renewables, you have to install storage to go alongside that. And that works in a kind of percentage terms. So if you install 10 megawatts of solar, you have to install between 10 and 15% of that as battery storage with a 1 to 2 hour duration. So, and each province has kind of ranges in terms of how high those targets are. So that's really a key driver there. And that came in January 2022. So that's when we saw a lot of projects kind of get going in the Chinese market. In the US, it's really more a story around particular states. So the majority of projects which have come online so far have been in California and in Texas. And that really comes down to those market mechanisms in those two states and basically where you can make money. And then the other big thing in the US is you've got the investment tax credit, which was part of the Inflation Reduction Act. This is something that did exist previously, but was basically being phased out and was only for solar paired storage. So they've essentially changed that now. So standalone storage can access it and also extended it out to 2025. And with that, you can essentially get kind of a 30% CapEx saving or tax credit for each project you install. And that can be extended further to 50% if you meet a number of certain kind of energy community requirements. So a lot of support from those two regions.
Likely to see anything along those lines in Europe?
So, I mean, Europe historically has been pretty slow to get going in terms of the energy storage space. There's a few exceptions. The UK and Ireland are kind of the leading players in the grid market. Right now, the EU is going through kind of a big reform, which is part of the EU Green Deal Industrial Plan, which was kind of their reaction to the Inflation Reduction Act. With that, they're doing a full reform of the electricity market design. And within that, there's a lot of kind of specification of the role of storage and demand response measures and how important they're going to be. Right now, there's not really the same level of funding as what we see in the US, but there should be more clarity around that in the months and years to come. So definitely we'll see more support coming through from Europe, but right now it's not really as clear cut as elsewhere.
Okay, and then just going back to what Howard mentioned, I stand corrected, but I think Tesla did about 6.5 gigawatt hours last year. They're now scaling Lathrop, and then they're looking to put a plant in China, which will give them a combined energy storage capacity of 80 gigawatt hours. So, I mean, exponential growth. Who do you see taking that demand off them? I think I saw you tweet or something, the China probably for export, but in the US, is some of that linked to the charging network, say for the semi, or is it all storage, or what's going to be used for?
Yeah, so the Lathrop facility and the one in Shanghai as well, they're both for megapack production. So there's really large units that you see kind of going in grids and going in related to solar farms. So they'll be primarily serving kind of grid markets and renewable markets rather than necessarily the kind of supercharger network. The way that we see it is the Lathrop facility should serve kind of the US market and will probably be the first of, potentially a few in the US because the demand is really quite significant. And then the Chinese megapack factory, we see that as potentially kind of serving exports to the rest of Asia. So particularly the Australian market is pretty strong. And then also potentially exporting into Europe, kind of on the precedent that Europe doesn't have its own megapack factory yet, which again is something that we'll likely see in the kind of next year or even sooner, I expect. I mean, the demand for these batteries and these systems is really high, and I would say that that's almost the pinch point of the market right now. The cell capacity is there, but in terms of people actually manufacturing the systems, there's a lot of players involved, but not many of them have kind of the scale that Tesla is at right now or is getting towards.
And let me just understand, is it CATL LFP cells that are going into those?
Yeah, exactly. So they're purchasing cells and then assembling them into their own packs and then into their own systems. What that does mean is they can tap into the $10 per kilowatt hour part of the production tax credit. So that's a pretty nice add-on there for those megapack facilities in the US.
Right. And let me just understand, you mentioned as well that for energy storage, there might be a pivot towards slightly bit larger cell format. So at the moment, are those cells that, say, Tesla and others are using, are those essentially just EV cells, or is it?
No, so if you go back like maybe 18 months to 2 years, they really were kind of acting as a surplus market to the EV space. So cells were, just cells that were being produced for EV were just going into these storage projects and storage systems. But there's been a bit of a pivot over the last few years as this market has picked up, and you're starting to have cells that are designed dedicated to stationary storage. And the real trend here is basically to a larger cell format. So you're looking at prismatic cells, but basically you're kind of pushing up the capacity of the cells. So CATL last year came with a 280 amp hour cell, and that's just a single cell. With that, you're getting a cycle life of around 8,000 cycles. And then since then, we've seen a whole range of the Chinese players announce even bigger single cells. And the largest one we've seen right now is EV Energy, and theirs is 560 amp hours. And with that, you're getting around 12,000 cycles. So you're starting to get into pretty long lifetimes for how long these battery storage assets will last.
Yeah, I noticed on CATL's results, they actually had a specific line item for energy storage. So I guess that makes sense then in terms of the slightly different formatting.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing, I guess, with that as well is you're seeing kind of dedicated gigafactories set up just for energy storage. So whereas previously they would have been made in the same gigafactory, you have, a specific gigafactory that's just for energy storage batteries.
And if we can just talk about the cathodes and these, the market has shifted away. It was a bit of NMC. It looks to be almost all heading towards LFP now. Now we're seeing sodium ion rear its head, I guess, when lithium prices were really high. So the question is, can you talk a little about how the comparative performance in terms of cycle life and so on of sodium ion versus lithium, and if you think sodium ion is going to be a major player in this space?
Yeah, so I mean, right now LFP is really the chemistry of choice in storage. With these new cell formats that are coming out, you are getting towards pretty impressive cycle lives. And sodium ion batteries aren't quite at that level. You have a few players who are reporting kind of 6,000 to 8,000 cycles, which if you compare that to like a normal LFP cell, it is pretty good. And people would have been very happy with that even a year ago, I'd say. But these new LFP cells are definitely kind of pushing the limits or getting towards quite an impressive level of cycle life. I mean, sodium ion, we do expect it to play a big part in this market. It's interesting in the way that it's not a drastic change in the sense that if you're a system manufacturer, so if you're one of the big players, say you're Tesla or say you're Fluence or any of the other big players in terms of system manufacturing, ultimately for them it doesn't really matter what the cell chemistry is. They switched over from NCM batteries to LFP batteries in the last 2 years or so, and that same change could happen with sodium ion. The big thing that we see, and speaking to some of the kind of big integrators as well, is there's a kind of sense of hesitancy around sodium ion right now. And I think we will see it happening a lot faster in China than anywhere else. And you'll see, I mean, there's a 60 megawatt hour sodium ion project which is planned to come online this year in China. But I think it will be a few years before we see projects of that scale really hitting the kind of US or European markets, just because some of these integrators are like, we just got used to LFP, or we don't want a new chemistry right now. So
I mean, it's interesting now that you've talked about the bigger formatting. If you're talking about double the cycle life for LFP, then that adds another dimension into the price compete point. So is there sort of I don't know if it's as simple as this, but is there some kind of an inflection point on the lithium carbonate price that sort of drives sodium ion as to being meaningfully cheaper? Or
I mean, I don't know if there's a specific price point, but I think definitely last year when carbonate went up so much, everyone was really looking for a cheaper alternative, which is potentially why sodium ion got so much hype in the last year. With lithium prices lower, that price differential does get smaller, and it becomes maybe a bit more of a close game that you're playing with. The other thing you can make is not just the kind of sodium lithium comparison when comparing the prices. One of the other big like savings within sodium ion is you can use an aluminium current collector instead of copper. So that's another point where you can cut some costs. And now the kind of anode supply chain for sodium ion isn't really, you're using hard carbon essentially, it's not established. So right now the anode is more expensive than in an LFP cell. There's no reason that it can't, pretty cheap, but right now that price differential is kind of fluctuating, I would say, with lithium price.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things, question I was going to ask, and I've asked elsewhere, is, we've seen pinch points as lithium ion, production has expanded so quickly. Are we going to see supply chain? Would there be pinch points for sodium ion if it scales, at a really quick pace?
Yeah, definitely. The whole supply chain has to be built up, and that's something that is potentially holding it back right now, particularly on the anode side. That's where we do see that point currently. I mean, lots is being announced kind of every week. We're seeing more announcements come out of China in terms of both sodium ion kind of cell capacity, but also anode and cathode. So there's things happening, but as with anything, when it's scaling, it's going to take a bit of time to work out all the cracks and make it.
And if we just sort of looked at it the prism of the IRA and wanting a sort of closed loop supply chain, where they're still getting their heads around, there's some work to do with LFP. Will sodium ion bring would it bring a lot of challenges if the US wanted to go it alone?
I mean, potentially like less so than you're potentially working with less critical materials than say an NCM cell or LFP cell. So potentially it would be easier to set up a supply chain. There are a few sodium ion players who are kind of working in the US market and have some plans. There's this, they're basically just trying to get things going. But I think right now it is very much a China story, apart from these few players. I've just got the names of a couple of them. So one of the ones in the US, which is quite interesting actually, is a company called Natron Energy. So they only have their energy density is really low. So they're basically going in like 20 to 30 watt hours per kilogram. And that's mainly to serve like the telecoms and UPS markets. But right now, they don't have much capacity. So it's still early days. But I think we'll see more players coming through in the US and European market over time as well.
Just going back to the US, you've got obviously Tesla it's got Lathrop going to 40 gigawatt hours. I think we've seen some announcements from Freya and some of who are the other players in the US that are looking to scale up, on the LFP or on the energy storage side?
Yeah, so I mean, Freya are definitely have pretty ambitious plans in terms of kind of the cell capacity side of things. So with their US facility, they're looking at 34 gigawatt hours. And it's likely that we'd see some kind of integrated system manufacturing. They announced in Europe that they're going to have like kind of connected system manufacturing with Nidec. So I imagine there'll be something similar we'd see in the US market as well from Freya. Some of the other ones in the US, LG announced just a couple of weeks ago a dedicated 16 gigawatt hour line for ESS cells. And they've also got a relationship with Hanwha to do kind of the system side of things. Fluence announced their Utah facility, and I think that's around 6 gigawatt hours. So there's definitely a few players getting going. Core Power, Our Next Energy, they've all got kind of plans in the works for systems and cells. So there's activity happening, but right now Tesla's kind of, set quite a high standard, I guess, for 40 gigawatt hours. It's quite a lot more than what anyone else is going at.
I'm pretty bullish on ESS. If I can put you on the spot and say, what do you think gigawatt hours deployed in 2025 and 2030? What are your numbers?
Yeah, so in 2025, we're seeing over 200 gigawatt hours globally, and that's on the grid, across the grid and behind the meter markets. And then by 2030, like doubling again, so getting up towards like 500 gigawatt hours.
This year you said it's 140 to 150. Now you're telling me 2025 is only 200.
Yeah, 240. It's not far away, 2025.
Well, it's 2 years of growth, so that's quite a slowdown from here.
I mean, you're working from a higher base, though. I think that's the thing.
That's a cop out.
Yeah. what I would say with this market is, it's growing faster than I think anyone expected or really envisioned, and there really is no kind of upper cap. So, when we're looking at the EV market and forecasting that, and when anyone's forecasting that, really what you're looking at is what percentage of ICE vehicles are going to be electrified. With this market, the number of applications and use cases is growing all the time. And really it comes down to, are there going to be enough systems produced? And that's really what the kind of pinch point is there. In the same way.
I was about to ask. So the cells are, there seems to be a ramp up in cell capacity. So it really is building the systems to install it.
Exactly. So that's, I mean, some of those figures that I kind of listed off in the US, other than Tesla saying 40 gigawatt hours, the majority of those other ones were around kind of 10 to 20 gigawatt hours. And even if you add those all up, you're still, you're struggling to get up to really, really high numbers. But of course, if we see Tesla come and announce 3 more megapack facilities in the US, then, we'd upgrade our forecast. And in the same way that there's a lot of applications which are just emerging. So one of the ones I saw recently was, in green hydrogen production, essentially to have battery storage paired with it to ensure that you can produce your green hydrogen throughout the whole day. Another big one being at nuclear plants. So if you're installing a nuclear facility, basically have the same capacity but as a battery, with the idea being you over the night, rather than selling directly to the grid, you charge up your battery, and then during the day you essentially are double discharging from both the nuclear facility and the battery. So there's all sorts of these applications which are really just emerging and have a lot of potential to make this market even bigger.
And in terms of, so we have a sense of how long it takes on the lithium ion supply chain, to build the various, plants and so on in that. How long does it take to build like a systems plant for energy storage?
Yeah, I mean, it should be a lot faster. You're really dealing with like hardware a lot more than anything else, hardware and software. So, I mean, I guess Lathrop is a good example from that being announced. They're ramping up right now. So I would say, I mean, maybe to get something that's 40 gigawatt hours up to full capacity, you might be looking at like 2 years from announcement. But that's something that it should be like maybe once they've done it once as well, they can do it faster. But because it is much more on the hardware and the software side rather than more kind of intricacies with cells, it should be a lot faster.
So that chain could scale fairly quickly then.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, just going back to your numbers of gigawatt hours deployed, what percentage do you think will be lithium ion based versus sodium ion or alternative, just so we can get assessment for those who do lithium forecasting?
Pretty high levels of lithium, kind of out to 2030. So in 2030, we're saying around 90% of that is lithium ion.
90%.
Yeah.
So for there's some kind of, I saw, your friend ex-CRU George Heppel basically saying he's going to stop paying for any research from any provider that doesn't include sodium ion in it. So
we do include it, but we think it's going to take time. So okay. I mean, what we're saying basically is in 2025 we're expecting about 7 gigawatt hours of sodium ion deployed in this market in that year. So, and then by 2030 you're looking at close to like 30 gigawatt hours of sodium ion coming online in terms of storage. But that's another thing as well, where right now it would be hard for us to kind of go in and say, okay, this market could be 50% sodium ion, because the capacity just isn't there and hasn't been announced yet. And also that reluctance that we are hearing from a lot of the Western integrators. So until we kind of see a bit more progress in the sodium ion space, I think that's what's our limiting factor right now in terms of going, this is going to be a massive market for sodium ion. It is going to be massive, but it's just going to take a bit of time.
Okay. Yeah. Iola, I mean, so much of our bet, I'm the lithium ion bull, right? That's my tagline. And a lot of that is predicated on the fact that it's been utilized for, 25 years, so, and that's why it's a safe, known chemistry, right? And if you're for EVs in particular, that's critically important, right? A 10-year warranty battery. Sodium ion is only a few years into it. So just from a ubiquity point of view, right? It's one thing that you could announce a big battery factory based on lithium ion. I guess some of those factories can switch to sodium ion, but could you address that kind of safety ubiquity question, as because there's always, I was at a conference yesterday and to the extent that people question whether or not, if lithium prices are too high, then you'll substitute, right? It just raises doubt, which then slows investment. And I'm of the mind of like, we need competing technologies. Like for energy storage, lithium is probably not the best use, right? It's better to put it into EVs. So I guess just address that kind of a broad sense. It's not just this Chinese technology versus a US technology. It's just the number of years and safety and regulations, et cetera, apart from energy density.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing with sodium ion is, as much as it is, only hitting news stories in the last year, these developments have been going on for a long time. And it really was just the fact that lithium prices got so high that, spurred it back to the center of conversation and potentially kind of sped up some plans. So, I mean, in terms of, the stats that people are getting from these batteries, they are pretty promising. Like, the safety is good. You're working obviously with a lower energy density, but for certain applications, that's not too much of an issue. And, you know, we added sodium ion into our EV forecast recently as well. But the way that we see it is primarily going to be in your kind of A and B segment vehicles, where you're potentially looking at ranges of, say, 100 to 150 kilometers. And, you know, when you actually think about this in terms of battery demand, okay, it may be going into 20% of EVs, but these are the vehicles which have the smaller pack size anyway. So when that actually translates to battery demand, it's close to kind of, you know, 10%, 6% of the market. So it's going to be part of the picture, but I think, you know, it's not going to just come in and suddenly destroy the whole lithium market, lithium industry. That's definitely not the case.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Iola. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you for taking the time, and look forward to continuing the dialogue.